Hello, everyone. We'll give a minute or two until the number of participants stabilize, and then we'll kick off. Great, I think we can get started. Greetings from Kigali, Rwanda, everyone. And thank you for joining the last lecture on this virtual PhD course on urban economics in developing countries. This course is co-hosted by the Bureau of Research and Economic Analysis of Development and the International Growth Center. And because this is the last lecture, I just wanted to say this has been an absolute pleasure to learn from so many brilliant scholars throughout the course. And I must say as well, personally, I learned a lot from the conversations and questions in the chat. I definitely wasn't expecting such an engaging cohort, and you all have been absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much for your time and active participation. My name is Juliana Oliveira Cunha. I'm a policy economist at the IGC Cities That Work initiative, and I'll be chairing today's lecture, which will be focusing on the very important topic of sustainable urbanization, or how we're calling it, adapting the city. So to teach us something about this, we're very privileged to be joined today by two incredible scholars. So with us today is Professor Matthew Kahn, who's a professor of economics at the University of Southern California. And we're also very fortunate to be joined by Siqi Zhang, who's a professor of urban and real estate sustainability at the MIT. So thank you very much, Professors Matt and Siqi, for joining us today. As in previous weeks, a few housekeeping items before we start the lecture. This will be 1 hour broadly delivered by Matt, then Siqi, and it will be followed by a 20 to 30-minute Q&A. So if anyone would like to act as a live participant during this lecture, meaning you have access to mic and video, and can interact verbally during the Q&A, please virtually raise your hand now. And Greg, our technical assistant, will randomly select a few of you to join in. And for the other participants, as in previous week, please type any questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And you can submit questions at any point during the discussion, as well as upvote a question by clicking the thumbs up icon. I'd like to know that we're recording all lectures in this series, and these recordings will be made available on IGC's website, along with the slides and reading lists from the lectures. Now, because this is our last one, I just wanted to share a final couple of points. Firstly, Greg will be posting a short feedback survey in the chat, which will also show up in your browsers after the end of this lecture, and I believe in your email inboxes as well. So we kindly ask that you take a minute or two to fill in the survey and share with us what you liked most about the course, but also anything that we can improve on in the future. Secondly, as promised, those of you who attended at least 7 lectures will be issued with certificates of completion, and you should expect to receive them by email in the next month. And then finally, some of you may or may not know, but VoxDev has started a mini series of podcast episodes of around 30 minutes, covering the main discussion points in the lectures with the professors. So if you're looking for a quick refresh of what we discussed throughout the course, this is a really good opportunity to do so. And I believe Greg will be posting the link to the podcast in the chat as well. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Matt to lead off with the lecture. Thank you.
Folks, I'm so happy to be here and to have this opportunity, and I hope you can see my slides. My title is a mouthful, and I'm delighted to share this lecture with my good friend Siqi Zhang. My talk is titled The Role of Urbanization in Accelerating the Pace of Climate Change Adaptation in the Developing World. And there are so many open research questions here. There's so much work for you guys to do. And so I want to be a little bit of a cheerleader this morning in getting you excited about this topic at the intersection of development economics, environmental economics, and urban economics. Folks, let me start with the bad news. And I know all of you know this, and Sichi's presentation is going to focus on decarbonizing the urban real estate sector. Time goes from 1955 through when I was born in 1966 up to the present. And on the vertical axis is the world's carbon dioxide concentration. And you can see with almost a straight line, you can fit the data. Of course, I celebrate that we're decarbonizing the transport sector and the electricity grid. But the developing world needs to consume so much more power for it to flourish and to achieve its own conception of the good life. I think it's a great thing that energy consumption is going to rise in the developing world. But due to the free rider problem, we all know that the global externality of climate change is going to continue to get worse. And this is why I work on adaptation. In two books about the United States that nobody buys and nobody reads, but my mother likes these books, I have explored the microeconomics of our incentives to adapt to the very serious challenges that places like my Los Angeles, that places like London, that places like Cairo, Nairobi, every city around the world faces challenges to quality of life, posing challenges on safety, comfort, survival, productivity. And my books focused on the U.S. adaptation challenge. I want to make the case today that there's very exciting work for you to do on how cities in the developing world will adapt to these challenges. Guys, I want to talk through 6 points, and we're going to make my slides available to you. And I hope that we're going to have an ongoing discussion. Please email me with your questions. There's 6 things I'm going to do today. I briefly will talk about the rural to urban transition. I'll make the case that cities have economies that are more robust to extreme weather events than the agricultural sector. In the spirit of Ed Glaeser and other great urban economists, I'll make the case that urbanization and human capital investment go hand in hand. I will make the usual case that with urban growth, individuals have more purchasing power to protect themselves. Cities have the resources to invest in their local public goods to protect themselves, to offset the strong punches Mother Nature is throwing. I then will talk about one of Vernon Henderson's major topics, the importance that a nation have a system of cities. The United States has been blessed that we have 300 major cities, giving people a choice. We'll talk about in nations where there's more choices of cities and neighborhoods, urbanites are more likely to be able to adapt to the very serious challenges we face. The 2 last topics will focus on when does government crowd out private adaptation investment and when does it crowd it in? And then I'll end with some ideas from the Nobel laureate Robert Lucas. Folks, the rural to urban transition. A few years ago, Max Offhammer and I wrote a paper together that I'm proud of, but nobody's reading and nobody's citing. What we do at the start of this paper is we talk about how climate change affects the profitability of farmers, and farmers have an opportunity cost. If their profits from what they've been growing decline, they can either substitute to another crop that can take the heat or is more drought resistant, or they can move to the cities. As Mushfiq and his co-authors studied in their great monsoon paper set in Bangladesh, rural people, by being poor, often face frictions in moving to the cities. And in their great field experiment, where they randomized giving people those transport bus tickets, they documented that rural people could better adapt and smooth their consumption in the face of monsoon risk. When due to the bus pass, a child could move to the city and find work. Now, a point that Ed Glaeser and I have often discussed is as rural people in the developing world move to the cities, big cities can become too big as slums expand in size, as the tragedy of the commons in cities will occur. So I think there's very exciting work that as rural people move to the cities, which cities will they move to? And will those cities get too big too fast? And that's what I meant by this point. Will the competitive equilibrium be a Pareto optimum? Because individual migrants will compare their utility They'll move to the city with the highest utility, while a Pareto planner would equate the marginal utilities, would allocate people across rural and urban areas to maximize a social welfare function, and the first order conditions would equate the marginal utilities. And we can come back to the Q&A, but I think that's a very important point. So do some cities actually need an entry tax if they're getting too big, a Pigouvian tax, to encourage individuals to move to other second and third tier cities? Now, the second point I want to make in this brief lecture is to return to some of Ed Glazer's great work, that cities and skills are complements. When rural people expect that they're going to live their lives in cities, there is a nascent literature, this great paper by Robert Jensen and Nolan Miller. Rural parents invest more in their children's human capital when they expect that their children will live their lives in cities. And so I think there's great work your generation could do exploring this highly optimistic hypothesis that nations that begin the rural to urban transition, the parents have strong incentives in the countryside to invest in the human capital of the young people, because cities pay a higher return to skill. And this is how a nation can accelerate both its urban growth, its human capital accumulation, and through economic development, be better able to adapt to climate change. And guys, I forgot that I didn't even define what the words adapt to climate change mean. I mean that as Mother Nature punches localities harder, whether it's a Phoenix, a Los Angeles, a London, a Cairo, that the people and firms in those areas suffer less short-term and long-term damage from those punches. I don't believe that there's a stationary climate damage function. I believe using markets and our human capital and our wits, that we have an increased capacity to offset the serious harm that Mother Nature is throwing at us because we've unleashed climate change. Folks, the final paper is a little bit of advertising. With my great co-authors, we wrote a paper recently set in Kampala, Uganda, where we document, similar to Nick Bloom's work on manager quality, we document that Kampala, Uganda has serious air pollution issues within the city. And we document that higher quality managers, and we measure manager quality using Nick Bloom's index, higher quality managers are doing a better job protecting their workers from the pollution, of buying masks and setting up the workday to protect workers from those threats. We are not passive victims as Mother Nature is punching us harder, and human capital plays a key role in protecting us, of being aware of threats and being proactive for how to offset such threats. Folks, the next point I want to make is a little bit of cheerleading, and I'm going to do this one quick, on the adaptation benefits of economic development. Guys, some young people turn to me and say, Matt, your best paper is kind of this funky paper. That first paper I wrote was a cross-national paper documenting that as nations grow richer, the death count they suffer from natural disasters declines. And this was the cleanest test I could ever think of for testing the hypothesis that economic development insulates an economy. Urban economic development allows less damage occurs. And we document this in our floods paper also, the second paper. So both using death tolls from natural disasters, and in the second paper, we use lights at night dynamics. We document in our paper that cities that experience a flood, when a richer city experiences a flood, lights at night dim less and recover more quickly than in a poorer city. If a poorer city gets hit with a flood, the lights at night dim more and they recover more slowly than in a rich city. Folks, I, of course, appreciate that poor people face the greatest risks from climate change. And for those who want to read an optimistic US-based paper, I'd ask you to read my paper, Climate Change Adaptation, Lessons from Free to Choose. The last bullet point is this great paper by Karen Clay, Joe Shapiro, Alan, Olivier, and Michael, where they document that in the United States, over the 20th century, as more Americans have had air conditioners, high heat has caused less death. During summers, we have suffered lower death rates. For those who want some optimism about this life, this is an example about how market products that richer urbanites can afford help to offset risk. Folks, the next point I want to make in my quick outline refers to the system of cities. In larger nations with more land area, there's more cities and neighborhoods to choose from. I am an eternal optimist, and my mother says that I believe in magical thinking. And I love my mother, and I know why she says that. But I'm always searching. I'm always optimistic. I understand that in smaller nations with less land area and fewer cities, there are fewer adaptation possibilities. And I think that that's a very important point. I want to return to this famous paper by Alberto Ades and Ed Glazer. They argued in this old QJE paper set in South America that in many nations, the dominant city can have 40 or 50% of the nation's population. I want to conjecture to you young people that there are greater adaptation possibilities when a nation has a more diversified system of cities. If a nation has one dominant city, it's sort of holding an undiversified portfolio as it's put all of its eggs in one basket. They focused on the political economy, that people are moving to the capital city in terms of rent seeking. Now that we're focused on climate change, I think it's time to revisit their paper on a nation that has one dominant city. I'm going to repeat myself, has put all of its eggs in one basket and doesn't offer enough of a menu for potential urbanites to consider. I also mentioned this famous paper by Rob Jensen, where he showed the power of cell phones in directing fishermen to the right market to sell their fish. Because of the IT revolution, people all over the developing world have access to real-time information about threats and opportunities, and this increases the likelihood that they move to the right city. I understand that there are information frictions, and that those can slow down the efficient allocation of resources. But in our IT revolution world, whether it's knowing that a natural disaster has occurred or knowing where there's jobs and where there's opportunities, rural people are increasingly informed about where to go to achieve their own conception of the good life. They have choice and they're aware of this menu. Folks, I now want to talk about housing markets and the climate change challenge. And I want to briefly advertise my new paper with Sebastian, Daryl, and Rob Metcalf. So in the United States, there is a company called First Street Foundation. And for every street address in the United States, they are providing risk scores, in this case, flood risk scores, for how risky is the property. Guys, I claim that going forward, we're going to see these climate risk report cards for developing cities. As home buyers in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh's cities are aware of the risks they face, basic hedonic real estate analysis predicts location, location, location. Areas closer to a central business district will have a higher price. All else equal, our field experiment documents. So in our field experiment, people who were searching for housing across the United States cities all of a sudden learned the flood risk score for the properties they were looking at. And those who had been looking at high flood risk score areas who learned that the address faced flood risk substituted to safer areas. And if they continued to bid for the risky homes, they bid less for those homes. And we found this effect in both pro-Donald Trump areas and pro-Joe Biden areas. So both Republicans and Democrats were revealing that they care about these risk scores. Yes, this is a US study, but I claim that during your research careers, we're going to see better and better climate risk data for cities around the world, and people searching for housing in the developing world, seeking to be safe and comfortable, will use such information to make better choices for them. And if we all know that if an area is risky, there's going to be a home price discount, we get into issues of benevolent paternalism and how much of a libertarian you are. If a poor family wants to live in a risky place, in part because rents are cheap, will the local government allow them, or will it preclude them from doing so? And that is, I think, a very ripe research topic on where you stand on benevolent paternalism and adapting to climate change. Two more topics and we're done. Folks, I'm an old University of Chicago economist, and there's not that many left of us. And a classic question in University of Chicago, Sam Peltzman, Gary Becker economics is government can have good intentions. But when does government policy have unintended consequences? When does government action crowd out private action? An example you were taught in your macroeconomics class is if a government has generous Social Security to provide payments to old people when they're retired, do people save less for their retirement? That's an example of public savings crowding out private savings. In a similar sense, I am doing more research, both in the United States and in the developing world, of if government pays and subsidizes for place-based infrastructure like levees and seawalls in a New Orleans or in some below sea level part of India, is an unintended consequence of providing local safety subsidized with federal money that more people move to that area. Guys, I highly recommend this paper by Alan Chow of Stanford. This is a very important paper using frontier quantitative spatial models that you've learned in this course. And Alan explores that as the Indonesian city of Jakarta uses national money to pay for seawalls in Jakarta, too many people are moving there as this risky, as they perceive this city to be safe. Folks, that's the Peltzman effect of government investments crowding out private adaptation. The bottom bullet point is something I'm very passionate about, both in terms of public policy and in terms of research for you guys in every country around the world. I am interested in what government rules of the game would complement private adaptation efforts and not be a substitute. Let me give an example. Suppose that the federal government, say in the United States, said to localities, for every dollar you invest of your own money in seawalls, we will invest 50 cents. So that would be a matching grant. If localities tax their own residents to have skin in the game, to pay for local public goods for protecting against sea level rise, then the taxpayers in that city would have strong incentives to think through, is this a good use of our tax dollars? There's an opportunity cost of private consumption or other public goods like schooling or street safety. With large federal subsidies and with World Bank and IMF subsidies for infrastructure, I claim that some urban localities, when you don't have skin in the game, are you really thinking through your priorities? And so with my slight libertarian tendencies, I've been thinking about if we had rules of the game that encouraged localities to have more skin in the game in financing their own infrastructure, would the residents and the leaders of these cities do a better job prioritizing the right infrastructure and do a better job overseeing the contracting to actually install this irreversible capital? Folks, I want to end with another passion of mine, and I see that I'm on time. I've been watching the clock. I'm an avid reader of many economics journals. That's what old guys do. And what's going on this is a very exciting time in climate economics and in urban economics. And there's many young, outstanding scholars who I'm not going to name, who have perfected the following recipe for publishing a top 5 paper. How many young scholars I hear chant top 5, top 5. What these young people are doing is the following causal effect machine learning study. They're collecting country-specific data, and what they're doing is they're collecting data on extreme weather. So a study might be they're studying productivity in India as a function of outdoor heat. So by delta outcome, I mean, what is the change in a firm or a worker's productivity when it's extremely hot outside? So guys, let's take a look at this regression. And I realize my notation is terrible, where it says delta outcome. That dependent variable might be the change in a firm's productivity or a change in a worker's health, or how much stunting there is of children in a family from one year to the next as a function of what is the local weather. So that shock is a vector of what has been the local weather where that firm or family lives. And we can't run randomized field experiments here. God isn't that kind to us. So we try to exploit variation in this or that. And what researchers do is they use a panel estimator and recover beta, which I call beta hat. What I don't like in this literature is, and my fight with some young people in these papers that get published in Science and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, is that folks view their causal estimates as a law of physics. When they estimate this beta, they then go on and they extrapolate what the world will look like in the world 2100. So here's what they do. They take the historical data and they estimate beta, and that's fine. But then they use a climate change model to predict how much worse the weather will be in the future, call that delta shock in the future, and then they multiply their beta hat by that delta shock to predict what our future economy will be like because of climate change. And young people, that makes me nuts. Nuts, nuts, nuts. I reject this claim because it ignores economics. There's a feedback loop. Because researchers like us are recovering these causal effects and we are explaining them through the New York Times and our blogs and the IGC, there's a feedback loop. We are not passive victims. Folks, this is my final slide. As Mother Nature throws tougher punches at us, and as researchers like you and me estimate these causal effects, people learned from us and they changed their behavior. The Nobel laureate Robert Lucas in 1976 wrote his Lucas critique that you discussed in your macroeconomics classes. He claimed that as government changes the rules of the game, forward-looking households and firms change their behavior, and thus you cannot I'm stuttering. You cannot use historical relationships and naively extrapolate from them to predict our future. In a similar sense, yes, climate change is occurring. Yes, certain weather patterns are becoming more extreme. But climate science is increasingly aware of these effects, and climate science economics is teaching the public through our research these effects. And this stimulates new investments by entrepreneurs to come out with the next generation of products we need, and it stimulates government to think about what policies could cost effectively protect us. I claim that the cost of adaptation declines over time because of market capitalism and innovation. Many of these integrated assessment models in climate economics assumes that this is stationary. Richer people can protect themselves from many local weather risks. Thus, we need economic development in the developing world to help the new generation of urbanites to achieve their own goals to flourish. The whole world is adapting to similar problems of heat and drought. Folks, Paul Romer won the Nobel Prize for his ideas about ideas. As the whole world struggles with the climate change challenge, this actually creates an opportunity to learn because good ideas are public goods. So a theme in Ed Glazer's work is about idea generation and transmission in cities. This Zoom meeting, we are talking about ideas, and this is the root. So as the developing world urbanizes, this actually increases my optimism about our ability to adapt to the many real challenges of climate change because it goes hand in hand with human capital, more skilled people around the world seeking to help our problems. And so I think this is a nice segue into Sichi's presentation on the real estate sector, being very specific about decarbonization. Thank you very much.
Yeah, shall I go ahead? Okay, good. So thank you, Matt. Matt is very efficient and very on time. I think even ahead of time. So Matt, give me another 3 or 5 minutes because I have many more slides, but I will be very specific. I'm going to share my slides. So you can see my slides. Okay, so just now, Matt had a lot of big ideas, and now I'm gonna narrow down on the building sector, because building sector emit a lot of carbon emissions, and then how we can really decarbonize this sector. So that's basically my talk. So this is not like adaptation, it's more about mitigation. But you can also think about this as an adaptation to transition risks, like these regulations and all these carbon-related risks. So as I mentioned, when we think about buildings, on average, 1/3 of the energy use and the carbon emission come from buildings. And so basically, you can see that's the energy use and the emission. So that's why we focused on this. And as you know, that buildings, they are durable goods. Once they are built, they last for many, many decades, many years. So it's very critical. Otherwise, when you build a very low energy efficient building, and then you cannot change that much over these 50 years. So today I'm going to talk about 2 topics. First is to say, okay, I want to show you something like if you really make the building more energy efficient, or we call it green building, and you can really get some market benefit of that. So you can sell the building, or you can rent out the building as a green premium, which means this is a return to energy efficiency of the buildings. If that return is high enough, you can incentivize the developers, the builders to supply those green buildings. So I want to show you some of the evidence, and I will also show you some challenges later. The challenges, the drivers, and the barriers, even if there is a significant like return, why you couldn't see a lot of building decarbonization, and how we can accelerate this adoption of the high energy efficient technologies in the building sector. So first, show you something about the evidence for green premium. So we call this economics of green buildings. So think about this in a conceptual level. We have a green building and we have a brown building. Green building means more energy efficient, and then all else equal. So the argument is, if you look at the cash flow of the building, and of course, if you want to have a green building, you have incremental cost. According to some engineering literature, and it's about like 0.5 to 15% of incremental cost, because you need to invest in HVAC system, better lighting, and some insulation. And then if later in the entire life cycle, if this office building, say, and you can reduce your maintenance cost, you can reduce your energy bills, and then the tenants are willing to pay higher rent for such green buildings, then you can have some benefit. So the key thing is whether the benefit can, after you discount all the benefit, whether that can offset the cost or even generate a positive return. So in a very like a behavioral level, when we think about this chain of several stakeholders, the developers, the owners, and the tenants. Say that also the apartments, that you have the tenants of office buildings, you have firms as tenants. So from the literature, many papers already started this, and also literature review, they always observe on average, these greener buildings, they have a lot of benefit. They can reduce energy bills, they are more healthier, better indoor air quality, and the workers, the employees in those buildings are more productive. So the tenants, say the firms, they are willing to pay higher rent for this space in the green building. If they are willing to pay higher rent, and for owners of the green building, that's rent will become their income, and maybe also very popular with higher occupancy rate. So overall, and they will be willing to pay higher price to buy such green buildings in the market. If they pay higher price, that will turn into a higher sale price for the developers. Then the developers will be willing to invest that incremental cost to make the buildings more energy efficient. So that's basically the logical chain or the business chain of the green buildings if you want to really incentivize the market to supply green buildings. But of course, there are a lot of like market failures or barriers. One thing is information asymmetry. Later I will talk about this. But the good thing is there's a way to address this. We know that there's many green building certificates. I know in different countries you have different like certification systems. Like in the United States, always like a LEED. That's a very popular green building certificate, and Energy Star, and in UK is BREEAM, and then in Germany they have the passive house, and in China they have also green building like Energy Star and the Green Building Star. So that's all these certificates, and because common home buyers, they have very little knowledge of this. And then the government or the nonprofit organizations, they provide such certificate can solve this information asymmetry, so the buyers, they understand that when they buy or when they rent, those are really, really green buildings. This really can lead to those later benefit. And then with this, how to estimate, that's some like technical thing. And so this paper, 2010 paper, published in American Economic Review, was one of the first papers to estimate if you just build green buildings, of course you are doing good things for the society, but also whether you can also do well financially, whether you can really capture a green premium. So the idea is to run regression, hedonic regression, as a log price of the rent as a function of many of these building attributes. And basically you control for all other attributes. And then you have the location attributes, you have the these building attributes, and then you have a green indicator. For example, if this LEED certified building or this LEED and other Energy Star building, and then you have a green dummy. So this coefficient will tell you whether those green buildings can really claim a green premium. But the problem here is buildings are so different, locations like cities, buildings, they are so different. And if you just compare a green building versus a brown building, always it's like apple to orange. So it's because they are different in many ways. The green buildings, maybe they are newer and they are like more like high quality in other ways, like class A. And so it's not that easy to tease out the clean green premium. So in the literature, many papers, they always use different ways to make sure that they are really compare apple to apple, like a red apple versus a green apple. So there's many ways like matching. Matching is always the way they use. So they match like this green building with very nearby, very similar buildings, non-green buildings, then they calculate the premium. And so basically you say after you control for all other attributes, after you match apple to apple, the only difference is whether this building is more energy efficient. And then, for example, this 2010 paper, they did observe such a 2.6% of the rent premium for green buildings, which means if you really own a green building, and then you can claim 2.6% of the premium. And if you look at effective rent, even 7.6%, after you consider green buildings will also have a higher occupancy rate or lower vacancy rate. And of course, then sales price will be higher. So that's one study, but since 2010, so many studies, and not just the United States, but also Europe and Asia and Latin America, many studies. So basically, this 2018 literature review paper, they did a meta-analysis. They summarized all the studies, including here, if you can see, is my paper with Matt back to 2012. And we look at the Chinese market. At that time was very immature market, and we found like zero premium. But some studies, they found positive premiums mostly. And on average, they saw overall green building, they can claim 6% rent premium and 7.6% of the rent of the price premium. Of course, it's a big variation. And later you will see why they are different, because in some markets, there are a lot of problems, barriers, and even if you invest in green buildings, the green technology, you couldn't get financial return. So we need to figure out a way how to clear those barriers so that we can incentivize the market to provide more these energy efficient buildings. So this basically move on. Just now I give you some sense of, okay, empirically, looking into many markets, and it's a like optimistic evidence, at least on average, there is a positive financial return to the green buildings. However, I will show you the barriers. So here are the barriers. I want to show you some like a lot of studies in this area, but motivate this by this McKinsey curve. McKinsey is a global consultancy firm, right? They publish a lot of reports, and they work with many companies. They look at these building sector issues. And it's very famous in the report. They just showed this chart. So this chart is, okay, if we look at the building sector and the different ways to decarbonize, for example, lighting, switch to LED, and make your envelope more like energy efficient, and use more energy efficient appliance, and blah blah blah, water and HVAC, things like that. So surprisingly, all those investments, if you ideally will generate return by themselves. Say if you do this, later you save energy. If you save energy, your energy bills, monthly energy bills will be lower, or then can last longer time, and then you don't need to replace. So then they raise this question. Actually, if we want to reduce the carbon emission from the building sector, it's basically very economically beneficial and or very low cost. But why this like a very good business opportunity? Why it's not exploited? Why people didn't take advantage of that? And then later, more rigorous studies look into this, called this energy efficiency gap. So try to understand, try to explain. The investment in the energy efficient technologies or products is way below this optimal level, like ideally like this. So for this area, so they pointed out, I give you some literary papers to read, and of course we will share slides with you afterwards. And I recommend you read this very easy to read piece, like a textbook piece, 2004, then you understand this energy efficiency gap and different aspects, very good piece. And a review paper 2012 by Alcott and Greenston. And then they always talk about some failures. On the one hand, it's market failures. And market failures means energy efficiency has a lot of positive externalities, can reduce carbon emissions. That's a global issue. And the private sector won't consider that if those positive externalities cannot be internalized, which justify we need regulations and subsidies. Later, I will talk about this in New York City example. Or inadequate information, although it's good, but people, consumers, they don't know. They don't have that information. And we have a paper to look into this, how we can really provide more information to consumers, home buyers, so they are willing to pay higher price. And another example is a split incentive. So, and I will also talk about this. And then they talk about this non-market failure explanations, basically because the performance gap means, oh, those engineering models really underestimate the cost and overestimate the benefit. So if you really look at the real data, it's not the case. So that's can explain why there's such a gap. So here I just give you an example of my paper, 2016 paper. Look at the information, the role of information. So at that time, this is a developing country case. We started in China. So at that time, the home buyers, they didn't have enough knowledge about what does green building mean and what's the benefit they can get. So that's why you can see that at first the people, the common people there, and they didn't have the willingness to pay, even if that was a green building. Then we did this small experiment. We sent some students, my students, into like these green building communities and the non-green building communities, and we show them kind of information card. We kind of educated them, say, compare green building, non-green buildings. The science told us that they have a better like light and better indoor temperature and comfort level, and also can reduce your energy bills. And we asked them before we showed them the card and what's your willingness to pay. If later you need to you want to buy a new housing unit, and then we ask this question again after the information card intervention, and you can see that basically for those who at first had little knowledge, a significant increase of their willingness to pay after they got new information. So that's an example, especially in the developing countries, in the developing context, such information is quite important. Another example of the market failure is a split incentive. The split incentive is the following, especially for the rental properties, no matter it's office buildings or retail or apartments. So that's a question of who will pay the energy bill. So if like they always call like a triple net lease, in the triple net lease, the tenants, they are responsible to pay the bills. And then the owner, they only cover like the hallway, the elevator, those parts. So then it causes a misalignment, because if like the owner want to renovate the building, make it more energy efficient, however, then later the benefit, they cannot claim the benefit because the tenants' energy bills will reduce. The tenants will be very happy and they save money. And the owner couldn't get that return, so that the owner will lose incentive. Otherwise, if owner cover all the energy bills, the tenants will just pay a fixed amount, and then the owner, of course, they can get the benefit of the energy retrofit. But instead, the tenants they don't care because it's not out of their pocket, so they will just waste the energy and they don't care. They don't want to. They just keep all the lights on all the time. So they always a misalignment when there's owner and the tenants. So this recent paper by some Dutch scholars, so they look into this interesting question, and they use the Dutch housing market data, 3.8 million homes, and they really showed the evidence that the rental properties really lower energy efficiency compared to the owner-occupied homes, which means the owner-occupied, they invest, they gain. The rental property is not the case. And then that's later, of course, there's some innovative way. Now this market, they self-innovated, as Matt just now mentioned, always like this innovation. And then have the green lease, so-called green lease, so that you can add some elements into the lease, like a clause into lease, to better align the owner and tenants to share the benefit and cost of energy efficiency investment. And then move on to, okay, if we even address this information issue, we address this split incentive issue, but maybe still other barriers. That's a performance gap, means the engineering model, because if like a builder or developer, they decide whether or not to build a green building, they always rely on some models like projection, say, okay, if I do this incremental cost 5%, and can we use some model to project, if I do this later, the savings will be how much? And they always rely on some engineering models. And then, however, many papers, economics papers here, they use some examples to show the realized savings are much less than those projected savings. And the upfront cost is much higher than the projected engineering cost. For example, this paper, the QGE paper, and they look at this very big weatherization assessment program in Michigan. This weatherization means just to improve the insulation of the house, so that in the winter time, they won't lose energy that much, can reserve the energy, insulation, windows, very tight windows and doors. And then engineering model shows very good financial performance should be. However, when they look at data, they found that upfront cost about twice of actual energy savings, and the rate of return is negative. That can explain why the adoption of this program is so low. And then this recent paper by Peter Christensen from UIUC and his co-authors, he really used big data. He used big data to decompose the gap between the engineering model and the real data. And he found like decompose like rebound effect, small part. Rebound effect means when you make a house more energy efficient, then the users of the house, the residents in the house, they may they may be inclined to consume more energy because they saw their energy bills become smaller, so they want to be more comfortable, and then that's a rebound effect. But that can only explain a little bit. However, the buyers in the engineering model, 41%, for example, overestimate the savings in the wall insulation and also the installation, the construction sector really can explain a lot. And if like not enough like skilled labor, and then that can lead to higher cost and the delay of the process. That's 43%. So then after those very good big papers, I want to point you to some future directions, because I know many of you are thinking about your research direction, interesting research topic for your PhD. So in this area, building decarbonization, some very interesting work right now. One is use randomized control trials, like the randomized experiment, to really show very clear mechanism and the effectiveness of some policy interventions. For example, like this first paper, they just try to incentivize, give more information, some small incentive, and for the household to sign up for water audit. Some engineers will come to their house to find some ways to help them save water. And they found that there's a treatment group and a control group. Then they found that if they provide more information and just nudge them to do water audit, that will lead a lot of water saving. And similar ideas like the peer effect and the information acquisition value. So they just give the residents more information and more targeted information. And they saw that this really lead to better result of their program take up. So because it's so heterogeneous, right? If you think about this weatherization program means many homes, and different homes are so different: old ones, new ones, big ones, small ones, single family, multi-family, high-rise buildings, different building materials. So it's very hard, say, for the entire market, we just have one like benefit and cost parameter. That's not the case. So now there's some new literature, like for example, this first, still by the same group from UIUC, they use big data. They say, okay, use machine learning to target at the real properties that with relatively small investment in this building decarbonization, later generate enough very good benefit. So small cost and big benefit. It's not all the buildings are the same. So then they can really target at those buildings, at those properties, those homes that prioritize this government subsidy, because it's a limited subsidy, to those homes that you invest a bit money and will generate a lot of benefit. So, and then also some like research directions will be look at specific green technologies and to explain the adoption and how we can lower the barrier and accelerate adoption. For here, I'm gonna talk about my research as two examples of this new green technology, both about these heat pumps. I'm not sure whether many of whether you know this heat pump technology, because traditionally in the cold climate zones, like here I'm in Boston and many countries, they need winter heating, and they also need summer cooling, right? So traditionally, summer cooling is air conditioner already quite well developed this technology and adopt. But the winter heating traditionally always based on fossil fuel, like coal or natural gas or oil. So I did some study together with Matt when I was in China, and we know that if you just rely on coal for winter heating, then the winter the air pollution will be a big problem. And also another thing, of course, they emit carbon emission. So this new technology called a heat pump, so basically it can replace both winter heating and the air conditioners for summer cooling. So it's one machine and can do two roles. And then they use electricity. And later, when this grid, the electricity grid of the city become greener, more renewable energy, and then at that time, those homes also will have more and more this will be like net zero, will become like decarbonized. So that's basically the heat pump like this. So I want to link this to something like why people were considering heat pump and how they consider this, what are the barriers of this. So now we put this heat pump, this specific technology aside for a little bit, for 1 minute, and look at this regulation, because the regulation really pushed all the private sector to consider the adoption of those new technologies to reduce carbon emission. I will use one example. That's called a Local Law 97 in New York City. If you Google, it's a very famous one. So basically, now in the United States, more than 100 municipalities, they already announced the similar local regulations. So for example, this Local Law 97 New York City, it says it target at larger buildings, not like very small buildings, target larger buildings. Most of those buildings are commercial real estate. And then they said, okay, I will give you upper limit from 2024 and until 2050, actually. They have several steps. And for each period, they will impose the carbon emission cap on different building types, like educational, like means university campus, and residential, multifamily, and office buildings, etc. For each type, for each period, those are the cap of the carbon emission per square meter, per square feet per year. This basically. So your building, if your building exceeds this cap, so sorry, you need to pay a penalty to the city government. The penalty of the emission above those limit is very high, 268 per metric ton per year. Then you look at the New York City entire building stock, you will say, okay, 2024, actually this one was announced 2019, but will implement it at the end of this year. And if you look at the building stock for this 2024 limit, already 20% of all the buildings in New York City, they are above this cap, which means this 20% they need to pay penalty. And then if you move to 2030, almost 75% need to pay penalty, unless you take action. You take action means you decarbonize your buildings. If you sit there doing nothing, then you need to pay penalty. So this is a big push for this industry to think about this. For example, they even have this carbon emission calculator that help you to make some financial numbers. And you enter your building name and address, and they immediately tell you, okay, now you are totally safe. However, if you don't do anything, you don't do retrofit, 2030 to 2034, you need to pay this much of penalty to the city. And if you continue doing nothing, then you later need to hire penalty to the city. Then this owner of those commercial real estate become nervous and consider how to do. And then these financial numbers come in. Here, we look at one building, actually. We first look at one example, like a high-rise new office building in Manhattan, New York City. And we say, okay, this is not that simple because we are looking about future, right? This is a huge office building. If you really invest more money to decarbonize, say at first they plan to do natural gas-based heating. Now we are gonna totally change to heat pump. What will be the future changes? Then we are not very sure whether the market appreciates that. We are not sure whether that can get a rent premium. And we are not sure whether there's a reduced energy cost, because at least for now, electricity is, for now, the natural gas is cheaper than electricity. Although you may become more greener, but you have to pay higher energy bills because you switch from cheap natural gas to more expensive electricity. And another thing is these heat pumps, they will occupy space. This is a small like a graph to show you this high-rise building. For heat pumps, now the technology is still like early stage. They are big machines. So, and also they need to put not downstairs, not in the basement, but they need the air exposed to air, so they will occupy 2 entire floors, and with very tall ceiling, put machines there. So then this owner will lose a lot of space to generate rental revenue. Of course, they don't want. And also another uncertainty is future energy cost, and also whether the city will really decarbonize their grid. If they don't decarbonize the grid, the city hall, even if you switch to electricity, you are still dirty because you are using the electricity that is produced by natural gas. So those are all trade-offs, the benefit, cost, different scenarios, and then we run simulations. So then we need to provide some like suggestion, right? Or recommendation. It's a very practical problem. And then basically at first only 2 design options, either traditional, still natural gas, or totally become heat pump, use fully electric building. But later we added 3rd option is flexibility, means future is too uncertain. We want to wait and see. This is option value in that. So we will first build these floors and ready for later put machines. But for now, we don't put machines. We still lease out the space. And we still use natural gas for now. After 5 years, we will revisit. And then if at some time point, it's very clear the heat pump is more financially viable solution, then we switch. At that time, we already have the ready building envelope and the space that we can switch. So this really win. So that's our like office building, Manhattan, like that contact. Finally, I will finish up with this example, which is residential sector, common households. So we look at, of course, it's still US related, but I really try to get this into other countries. Residential heat pump. So basically you can see that adoption rate is so low in the northern part of the United States. The southern part, they only use this, mainly use this for air conditioner. It's just replace their air conditioner. And this new technology is very energy efficient, only consume 1/3 of the electricity for cooling. Of course, they switch because it's financially meaningful. So Florida, you will see that. However, for the winter heating, as I mentioned, the problems about winter heating, and then you can see the households, they are very rational. They choose new technology not because they think this is so good for the global climate change problem, but because that's beneficial financially. So then the benefit cost, the higher places they really adopt, but for those like Boston, like Massachusetts, no. Then we look into the challenge of this. We found out this new technology, the contractors, they are not skillful. They know how to install traditional heaters and traditional AC, but then for this new technology, they have to learn by doing. So it's a lot of variations. Heat pump cost, machine cost is one thing, but installation is another thing. Now, all the states, they give a lot of subsidies to this kind of programs, but the subsidy can only cover the machine. And however, this another like double the cost because of installation. However, the good thing is the contractors, the installers, the workers, they learn by doing. So as they install more, you can see that really the cost is going down, which is good news. However, we want to see what kind of mechanism. So they are choosing smaller heat pumps. They are choosing smaller capacity. Because at first they didn't know how to calculate the right capacity of the house. They didn't want the homeowners to complain, say later, oh, why this cannot generate heat? It's cold, my home is cold. So they try to give a buffer, then they install larger heat pump. Of course, that will be more expensive. And over time, they learned, they now understand how to estimate the optimal size. Not optimal, calculate the size. And then they start to downsizing the heat pumps, then become more efficient and cost effective. However, we found out actually they take advantage of the natural gas still cheaper than electricity. Then they still keep their natural gas old heating system as a backup. And then they install a smaller heat pump, mainly for cooling. But for the winter, when very cold days, they turn on their backup gas boiler heating system so that they still emit carbon emission, but they reduce their financial cost. So that's a kind of trade-off between the private benefit versus environmental benefit. So the way to think about this is more policy and the incentive is needed to really incentivize the household to totally replace the natural gas. Although we need to redo their financial calculation to make this financially beneficial for households. So that's an example of the barriers, the adoption, how to really improve that. I think I will stop here, and I use enough time, and now it's for questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt and Sichi. I really enjoyed both of your lectures. I think it was a great combination between both the adaptation and mitigation challenges. So thanks again for joining us today. As Sichi said, we're now over to the Q&A part. And I'll start off with 2 questions from the chat. And I appreciate that Matt and Sichi have started to answer some of them. But I ask, and I really want to encourage this today because it's our last lecture. I really encourage you to come to participate live. So please do raise your hands virtually so we can bring you in and you can put forward your questions live. But I thought I'd start off with sort of 2 very broad questions, I guess. But I think, yeah, I'd be very curious to hear general thoughts on them. And the first one is, how can climate-related mitigation adaptation efforts in urban areas ensure the inclusiveness of marginalized communities while avoiding the displacement and gentrification of these communities? So I think that speaks a lot to some of the trade-offs that you were highlighting there, Matt, in the beginning of the lecture. That's one. And then the second one, which I'd love to hear your thoughts on, because it can get very political sometimes, but there's a lot of talk about green growth, particularly in the policy discourses, but is green growth at all possible? And or is it just a utopian concept designed to take away developing countries' right to development? And the reason why I wanted to put that one forward is because, again, through your slides, I think you conveyed quite a powerful message on how these both development and sustainability go hand in hand. But yeah, I want to put those 2 forward. But again, highly encourage people to raise their hand and come in live. But over to you.
Juliana, I want to start. Those are great questions. I want to start with the first one, and I've wrestled with that. I would love, as an urbanist and as a world citizen, I'd love to live in a world where rural people, as they pursue their conception of the good life, that they're aware of which cities actually will welcome them. And so let me tell a story. If there's a mayor of a city who is seeking to engage in greater textile production, that city needs workers, young workers in factories. Such a city, I would hope, would welcome the rural people and spread the word to the rural countryside and have areas, I wouldn't say zoned for housing, but have areas ready for these individuals to move there. So if mayors are entrepreneurs and are seeking to build up their city, if they could send out the word that which cities in the country are actively looking for ambitious young people, perhaps who don't have an education, rural people, then the gains to trade might be larger. I'm very disturbed when mayors don't welcome rural people and intentionally make their lives miserable as almost a tax to move to the city. Sichi, can I bring you in? And I have some thoughts about green growth in a couple of.
Yes, good. So I want to talk about this from this mitigation or reduce carbon emission and energy bills perspective. I think that also has implication to this inequality issue, because I look into many affordable housing projects here in the US, of course, also back in China. So when you look at this low-income housing, and actually the energy bills is a big chunk of their energy monthly expenses. And if those buildings can be more energy efficient, that free up some income for them to use for other necessities. And the empirical studies already showed that for the more energy efficient buildings, like apartments or the buildings, their default rate on their mortgage also reduced, because at first they more likely, like low income, they more likely to default because they couldn't pay back, like ensure the payback of the mortgage, monthly payback. And then with this free up income, their default risk also reduced. That can also justify some lower interest rate and further relieve the burden. So that's basically is the example of this energy side.
I now want to turn to green growth. Michael Greenstone, the great environmental economist, in his research agenda, he talks about co-benefits, that if a nation such as India relies less on coal-fired power plants to generate the electricity that Indian families and firms need and substitutes to greener power, there are at least two benefits. Greenhouse gas emissions will fall, but in addition, local air pollution will decline, and that India's cities, the environmental Kuznets curve logic, India's cities as they develop have terrible PM 2.5. And so green growth isn't just a hippie phrase to me. To me, if India makes progress in decarbonizing the power grid, then I call that green growth, as the people of India in cities have cleaner air, which furthers their health and human capital development, and the economy keeps growing. Siqi, from our work on China, does that resonate with you?
Exactly. So I want to say that, for example, Matt and I, we did a paper like 10 years ago, and we look into the China's urbanization. So the basic idea is when you move people from rural to urban, actually their per capita carbon emission will reduce because now they have smaller homes. Right, they have more efficient building technology and all this lifestyle. So that can be like more energy efficient when you move certain amount of people from rural to urban. Another thing is many green technology like transportation, say mass transit, right? They need the economy of scale. If you have more people, the denser areas, much easier to deploy this public transit. That's a way of thinking about this green growth.
Great. Do any of the students who joined want to ask a question? If not, I'll just continue to go through some of the questions that received more thumbs up in the chat. But I thought a little one on economic incentives, I guess, for both of you. In your opinion, what can be more effective? Placing penalty, for example, on polluting the city, or offering incentives for less pollution, or, for example, encouraging urban forestry in the urban neighborhoods? So something on the incentives that would create a good mix, achieve some of these objectives. And then the other one, which I thought was interesting, particularly for very low income context, one of the students asked whether, if we use regressions in rural areas of Africa, the materials they use might have environmental effects like deforestation, and even in some urban areas, housed with asbestos roofs, and I think this is a very pressing policy issue here in Rwanda. Although they do have proper ventilation and other environmental qualities, they cannot be good for health because asbestos causes obviously a lot of health problems. So the question is, how can we measure whether a house is, green or achieve all the sustainability, I guess, objectives that we would want in these contexts? So two very, again, broad questions, but I would welcome your thoughts on them.
Juliana, before I hand this off to Siqi, because I know that I don't know the answer to your question about taxes versus subsidies, I hope that our young scholars are devising more A/B testing. In the spirit of Esther Duflo and Jay Powell, we need more field experiments in the developing world. I'm not Jeff Sachs. I don't know the answer. That was a joke. I think we need more humility among the urbanists and to launch different field experiments for us to learn what works. And so if I had a tattoo, it would say humility. And so both of those are plausible hypotheses, and I know that I don't know the answer. Siqi.
Yeah, I don't know the answer either, but I think in general, my observation, I don't think that's an answer, but my observation is here. So for the policy interventions, we also say that's two categories, carrots or sticks. The carrots basically the incentives, subsidies, and sticks will be regulations and enforcement. So my observation is in the building sector, in cities, always for the big guys, the government tend to use sticks. That's like local law 97. They only targeted big buildings because they know those are owned by institutional investors, rich people, rich like companies. So they say, okay, if you don't do this, penalty. Or they say, okay, if you don't do this, you are banned. You cannot run your business like that. For carrots, mainly go to common households. So that's like Massachusetts or whatever states and many other countries. If you install solar panel, if you do a heat pump, you get up to $10,000 as a subsidy. So that's a general observation I saw. I think that makes sense. You cannot just put penalty on common people. They already suffer so much from all these other burdens. Another thing is although they target as big developers or these big guys sticks, sometimes they are able to pass it on to common people. That's for example, we did research on this building codes, building energy codes, more and more stringent. You must achieve this level of energy efficiency, otherwise you cannot build. You cannot get permit to build new homes. And then this really scared away developers and then further reduce the housing supply and add on housing cost. And then later the developers, they won't absorb that by themselves. They will increase the price and the rent. So which means it's very hard. It's a tension between sustainability and housing affordability. It's a balance. You need to balance these two.
Great. Okay, I see we have some hands. So maybe over to Assad first, which I think was the first one who raised his hand. So if you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you so much, first of all, for this great series, a great course on urban economics, and also for this particular lecture today. I want to congratulate IGC and Brad for doing this. I'm sorry I can't put on my camera because I was traveling and I was listening to this lecture while traveling. I'm a development researcher based out of London and from Pakistan. And I want to ask this question for both of the Pakistan's experience. We've had recently enormous floods for past, like, let's just say 10 years. Almost every year we have these enormous floods, and then they uproot the communities, destroy their livelihoods. It has a lot of, sort of destruction that it causes. But when we talk about mitigation, or when we talk about adaptation to the climate catastrophes, since COP29 was just here, and one of the biggest issues that we were seeing in terms of the developing countries context was, where does the money come from? Who pays for the adaptation? Because adaptation will cost money. Mitigation will cost money. I mean, market incentives and penalties is something which is great. But if you sort of apply these kind of models to the countries like Pakistan or India or Bangladesh, where the governments are facing severe fiscal constraints, and they're constantly advocating for raising the funding for adaptation. So, and this is not happening. So the question is that how does the money is generated for, how does the finance is generated for the climate adaptation and mitigation? And thank you so much, and congratulations again.
Should I get another one, Matt, or do you want to go for it?
Very briefly, I think that's an absolutely essential issue. So Robert Lucas, the Nobel laureate, wrote a paper 30 years ago on why doesn't more private sector capital go to developing countries where the marginal product of capital is high? And this set off this huge literature in international macro. And I think that that great question is directly relevant. If we were to go to Wall Street and talk to these bankers of how do they view the risk and return of investing in Dhaka, investing in a Pakistani city? I, as an optimist, that was a very important question that we need more work on. The time consistency issue. Wall Street will be more likely to invest private money if they believe they're going to be paid back. So almost in a time consistency issue, what can developing countries do to commit that if investments are made in capital to reduce flood risk, to provide infrastructure and electricity, will the capitalist from New York get their money back? If that promise can be made more credible, the Chicago economist in me thinks that more money will flow. And that's what Lucas wrestled with. Because if Wall Street is spooked out, then we're back to IMF and World Bank and the Gates Foundation. The money has to come from somewhere. So I think there's very interesting links between urban, environmental, and international capital there.
Great. Okay. Ziqing?
No, I think Matt already answered very well. Let's move on to other questions.
Okay, so I see Francis put his camera on. So Francis, over to you. If you could keep your question very brief, we would appreciate it.
Thank you, Juliana. My note is to appreciate the team, the two professors, for the good presentation. My question is to regard to the green premium in comparison to the Kunzet curve or theory, and how do we avoid the issue of greenwashing? Because you find, yes, as we say, green premium, comparing the issue of green premium, like we have already done a paper which is to be published on green premium for use of sustainable aviation fuel for aviation in Africa and other part. But the issue is, as we have said, the issue of the fund. How do you ensure that as we do green premium for the building and the issue to do with greenwashing, how do we ensure that there is no greenwashing? Because the issue, the cost, for example, the travel cost, for example, for aviation, and this in this case for buildings, how do we ensure there is a synergy and it is also in line with the Paris Agreement, which is under discussion right now in Banku, the issue of funding, which is a major issue right now. Thank you.
Yes, that's a very good question. Actually, Matt and I, we have another paper many years ago. At that time, basically exactly greenwashing. Back to 2000, early 2000. At that time, there was no effective green building certificate in China. And then the developer, they just self-advertised their buildings to be green buildings. They say, oh, this is such a green building, and then blah, 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 as an advertisement. And because at that time, the market awareness is so low, and there's no other information channel, and the buyers, they believed in them. And then the developer really got some green premium for those self-claimed green buildings. And especially it's really a big problem when it's a pre-sale market. When the buyers, they bought, actually they didn't see the building. They only saw the big beautiful pictures and brochures. And then, however, after people move in those buildings, they later, after 1 or 2 or 3 years, they found out it's not a green building at all. And then later you observe that premium disappeared in the resale market and also in the rental market when this information become more public. And in terms of how to avoid this situation, I think first step is to set up a green certificate. Later, some developing countries, they have more and more. And then for some certificates also has a problem, also greenwashing, because it's a checklist. You just check boxes. You have this, you have that, then you become LEED certified. Yeah, if you have a bike rack, you have 5 points like that. Actually, nobody is riding bikes, but if you just put a bike rack there, you get some points. But now it's more like some improvement to say, okay, after you get this, you need to submit for 3 years every year your energy bills, or they will come here to audit your energy. I think that's more like a performance-based instead of checkbox-based.
Great. Over to Guy now. Guy, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much to professors, and I congratulate you. I have enjoyed these lectures. Let me come quickly to my point. I cannot have my video often. Our internet infrastructure are very weak. I am logging in from South Sudan. So my question is brief. We are now facing serious environmental issues. South Sudan is over floodings due to the floodings that's happening in Lake Victoria that affect all the countries along the Nile River. So in this situation, most of the decision making are driven by emotion. South Sudan sometimes would want to do the dredgings of the Nile River so that it offers the quick running of water and avoid the effect that is happening among the nearest urban settings. And at the same time, there is no proper environmental social impact assessment or impact assessment that can assess the level of risk that may be associated with the dredgings. To us in this forum, so what advice can we give the decision makers to consider the environmental impact assessment before any decision is taken regarding the dredging of the Nile River? Because it is a fight to serve the population, but at the same time, there's an expectation that it will have a long-term impact in our environments. That's my first question. The second question is like a kind of a comment and inquiries. Looking at a country like South Sudan and Sudan's our neighboring country, our participation in this kind of forum is somehow limited. So what can the center do to ensure that these areas are also included so that they participate in some of the research? I've actually draw an interest to continue participating from the time I participate for the first course, which was on environmental economics. And I've now enjoyed this urban economic. So I'm also requesting if there's a way to do the outreach so that most of the researchers, the junior academics, are able to access this forum. Thank you, and over to you.
Guy, thank you. A very brief answer and then a question to Sichi. I am fascinated by these regional public goods challenges when a bunch of neighbors who may have historical issues with each other share a common resource. And there's very interesting issues of the tragedy of the commons, the coast theorem, of how regional public goods issues are resolved. The Chicago economist in me would ask, are the property rights clear? If we sit down at a bargaining table, how could the bargaining process lead to progress? So, Sichi, my question for you, with the Mekong River and China and Vietnam, China's a big country. Any optimism in regional public goods issues in China, or does China just do what it wants to do?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So basically, for example, the pollution, air pollution and water pollution, they don't respect these political boundaries or the administrative boundaries. Just wind will just blow the pollutants and water will just bring the pollutant from the upstream to the downstream. So which means really this regional country level collaboration is so important. And I think for China, Vietnam, that specific case, I think they are trying to do something because they want to collaborate in other things like economic growth and supply chain collaboration, and they want to be friends. And if they both understand the pollution and the environmental issues are big, and I think they are doing things together, especially China is on the upstream, and Vietnam now in a more like a advantageous position in terms of the trade. And then I think they will just negotiate at the table. But I feel in general, this country level, that's a big challenge. But I think they are doing more and more when they want to also develop together.
Great. So Mohammed, over to you now. But if you could keep your question very, very short so we can make use of, I think, the last minute that we have in the lecture. Over to you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Juliana. And thank you so much, Professors Matthew and Tiggy. It has been really, really wonderful, informative session for us. I have a very quick question on the rural and urban migration. And you, Professor Siggy, you said that, okay, migration from rural to urban areas is actually helps us in managing the green thing and also managing the green development. But if we look at the evidence from the developing countries, especially from Pakistan and India, the situation is different. There is an increasing number of migrants. They are moving to the cities. But if you look at the scenario, the cities are getting worse and worse. And there has been a continuous realization of this phenomena within the government. They have been doing a lot of efforts, getting in the building codes, transitioning to the EVs, trying to clean their power grids, etc., but nothing is helping. If you look at the data plotted on a timeline, then you will see that with every passing year, the situation has been more worrisome. Even very recently, the air quality index has been, showing some very, very abnormal scenarios for Lahore and Delhi. So what do you think? With all these things in mind, the government is working, the private sector is working, everybody is thinking about this, and nothing is, helping. So this phenomena has been, puzzling all the policymakers. So I want to hear your take. What do you think, with your experience of working in China and other regions, how they did manage to come out of this scenario, and what the developing countries can do to help, have a better air quality and get over the public health concerns? Thank you, and over to you.
Muhammad,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to set you up. So the environmental Kuznets curve is one of the backbones of empirical environmental economics, that as nations develop and urbanize, that air and water pollution get worse, but then with further economic development, they get better. Sichi and I, in a series of articles, have explored the optimistic hypothesis that that curve can flatten over time. And Elon Musk, all the things we spoke today in Sichi's presentation can flatten that curve. But Mohammed's point is crucial. Sichi, where do you now stand on the flattening of the environmental Kuznets curve, that developing countries can have the win-win of economic growth without sharply rising pollution that we're seeing in Pakistan and India's cities?
Yes, I think, Mohammed, you really raised a very good point. Just now, I only mentioned the one side of the coin. I think that's you were talking about the other side. So basically, people from rural to urban have the potential to enjoy the scale of economy, the economy of scale and higher density that can improve the energy efficiency. But if the city is not prepared, like very poor infrastructure, not enough roads, and not enough clean water, then you have the crowding effect. So that's the negative side of this. So what you describe, I feel like the cities, they didn't have enough infrastructure to accommodate such a very huge flow of the rural to urban population. And as Matt just mentioned, the environmental Kuznets curve, I think the cities, they need to understand, if they want to keep the talents, they want to keep the workers, especially skilled workers, they cannot just continue doing that. They need to be more proactive instead of just put them in slums. Instead, they need to provide clean water, clean air, and blue sky, so that the workers will stay. Otherwise, they will just lose talents. I think that's basically endogenous. And if cities want to grow, and they understand that they need to keep the people happy, so then they have the incentive to do so.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I think that's a very, very good point to end the lecture on. So unfortunately, we're now at time. I need to close the discussion. But a huge thank you to both Matt and NCT for this wonderful lecture. This has been an absolute pleasure. And since I have the privilege of chairing the last lecture, I just wanted to maybe end this course on a very positive note by saying, or reaffirming what we've heard throughout the course, that urbanization is really shaping the trajectory of development across much of the global south, particularly Africa and South Asia. But many of the most pressing urban challenges are still underexplored and understudied. So I highly encourage you as young scholars, particularly from developing countries, to really, engage on some of these topics. And, because of your understanding of your local realities, and, whether you want to study the mega cities, the capital cities, or the secondary cities that are going to grow in the future, you can really shape the policies and innovations that will determine how people live, work, and thrive. and developing countries really need solutions grounded in context and in creativity as well. So you bring perspectives and insights that no one else really can replicate. So this is my message to you. Really go for the very difficult questions, seek those stories, collaborate across disciplines. I think this is something very interesting and really great about urban economics, as we often interacting amongst the different social disciplines. So yeah, really go deep for those questions. And thank you so much for joining us. We hope to engage with many of you in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.